Thank you all for coming back for more. We're at the middle of this exercise, and things will move faster now than they have before. We wanted to go back to this slide to review something that is important to remember. And that is that the 1850s in the United States were really turbulent years. They were not easy years politically. And there was a lot of reshuffling back and forth. Political parties came, political parties went. One went up, one came down. There were a lot of conflicts back and forth. There was conflicts in Congress, there was conflicts in the territories, there was conflicts in Washington. So these were very, very difficult times if you analyze how much each one of these issues took away from the national energies. I always like to point out that the Kansas-Nebraska issue worked into Bloody Kansas, worked into Topeka versus Lecompton, and then the realignment of the political parties culminating in Democrats fighting Democrats. We could talk about this for 6 hours easily, because there is just so much history here. But the basic thing was that the Northern Democrats, who were led by Stephen Douglas, who was the senator from Illinois, they were committed to squatter sovereignty. That is, or public sovereignty. The people who lived in a territory were supposed to decide whether they wanted slavery or no slavery. That was the commitment of the Northern Democrats. We have said this before, and we will say it again. That position really was very unpopular with the insiders in Washington, D.C., because the power was being given to the people, not to Congress. Congressmen were very jealous of their power. It may sound to us like a perfect solution, very democratic. The people there decide what they want to do. But no, giving them that power took away power and influence from the legislators. The southern part of the Democratic Party that was more or less led by Jefferson Davis believed in congressional sovereignty. That is, Congress could decide whether a territory was going to be with slavery or without slavery. And in the middle was President Buchanan, who was inaugurated in 1857. The issue came to a point with Topeka and Lecompton. These two were the original capitals of the territory of Kansas. Lecompton came up with a constitution that accepted slavery. On the other hand, Topeka did not accept slavery. The president, Buchanan, who was favorable to the South, preferred to have Kansas admitted with the choice of having slavery or not. So he locked horns in a way with both ends of the party, with the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. So there was a triangle of conflict there that lasted for a long time. The end result was that Kansas was only admitted to the Union as a state in 1861. It took them all those years of fighting, of conflict, of trying to negotiate an agreement till finally Kansas was admitted in 1861. Yes, please.
So while they were a territory, though, they had no representation.
They had no representation in Congress, no.
Okay.
Territories do not have. And it's very clear in the Constitution that Congress has absolute power over the territories.
But they were part of it.
Yes, they were part.
So the legislature. Kind of Puerto Rico.
So states as they grew, they went through this phase of organization called a territory, where they set up institutions like police, like the demographic registry, like the Board of Education, all these institutions that are necessary for a society to move forward. And then when everything was ready like that, then statehood was granted. That was going through the organization of a territory. The other thing was that land was plotted so that every point was accounted for. People would know who owns this piece of land and who owns that other parcel. So that was the whole purpose of organization.
When did the process start for Kansas? It culminated in the admission of Kansas to the Union. But when did all that process really begin?
Well, it began way back in the 1854 with the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Okay.
And Kansas was admitted as a free state only because by 1861, many, if not most, of the Southern senators had left Washington and gone back to their states that had seceded. That was the only way they could admit Kansas. It was a tough one to swallow. No doubt, no question about it. In 1858, there was an election in Illinois for the Senate. Up until 1913, senators, U.S. senators, were appointed by the legislatures of the various states. They were not elected by the people. So at that time, we could not vote for the governor or for the Mrs. Also Brooks. That's the name. We could not vote directly. We had to vote for legislators who themselves would then select who they wanted in the Senate. As originally planned, the Senate represented the state's legislatures. The House of Representatives stood for the people in general. But the Senate was responsible to the state legislatures. Lincoln wanted to take that seat in the Senate from Stephen Douglas. And Lincoln must have been dreaming, because there was no chance that he could take that seat away from Douglas. Douglas had been in the Senate for 12 years. He was very much well known and very liked. He was the incumbent. His party dominated the state legislature. He had a national reputation. He had run for president twice, but had not been selected by the Democratic Party. It was really like Samson and Goliath, somewhat reverted because Douglas was kind of short and Lincoln was kind of tall. But they agreed to a series of debates. It's hard to understand why did Douglas agree to a series of debates. The best explanation we can come up with is that he was eyeing a run for the presidency in 1860. And he knew that having those debates would give him a lot of exposure. That's about the only reason that really makes any sense. Because otherwise, he was a shoo-in. He didn't have to debate. He could go back to his basement and sit there and pout and do nothing. And he still would. There was nothing to it. When Lincoln got nominated by the Republican Party, he gave the House divided speech. And this phrase from Scripture was probably well known to everybody in that group. A house divided against itself cannot stand. He anticipated that sooner or later, the house would cease to be divided, that it would become all one thing or another. Actually, one gets the impression that Lincoln had anticipated that, particularly after the Dred Scott decision, that one day every state would have to allow slavery. And this is why he proposed a plan to remunerate people or states that would free their slaves. And that's yet to come. This is a very interesting speech, very well written and quite engaging. They went on to have a number of other debates in Ottawa, Freeport, Jonesboro, all around the state of Illinois. Illinois at that time was a free state. It was so free that it did not allow free blacks. Yeah, they did not allow free blacks or slaves. They did not allow either. A number of states were like that. Minnesota was like that for a while. Wisconsin, some of those states really would forbid blacks completely in their territory. No blacks, no conflict. That was the way they were thinking. The other thing we need to remember is that Lincoln was a politician. He wanted to win. And he could not win by espousing positions that were unpopular. He had to win votes. Therefore, he had to tell people what they wanted to hear up to a point. The first debate covered all kinds of topics, and accusations were traded freely. They really called each other names and were quite sharp at each other.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. Oh, no, we have seen nothing like it was at that time. Lincoln asked Douglas to reconcile popular sovereignty, that is, the people deciding which way they wanted to go, with the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision said that Congress cannot forbid a citizen from carrying his slaves into a territory. Congress does not have that power. This probably cost Douglas dearly, as he came up with the idea that the people of a territory can keep slavery out by not adopting a slave code or other legislation. In other words, they could make themselves difficult by not approving legislation. And that way, they could keep slavery out. You know how popular that was in the South? Very, very unpopular. So the Freeport Doctrine fueled the demand for a slave code and really drove a wedge between the North and the South. branches of the Democratic Party. This made Douglas, together with Lecompton, that he had weathered a couple of years before, very, very unpopular in the South. Even though we will have nice things to say about Mr. Douglas. The other thing to remember about these debates in Illinois was that Illinois is right next to Kentucky. And Kentucky is a slave state, or was a slave state. So the sympathy was with the slave states in Kentucky, in Illinois. So anything that was said or done, of course, had to be understood or accepted in the light of the proximity of one state to the other. These are some of the things that Lincoln said. And these are not things that we're making up. These were things that were said, were written down, were printed, and he did not ever rescind them or withdraw those statements. When he was accused of being in favor of, oh my God, Negro equality, he said, look, I am not or ever been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. That was Lincoln. And this was taken down by numerous people at the debates who were taking notes, and these things were printed. That was Lincoln. He also said there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together. His whole idea was to colonize the free slaves, send them to Africa, send them to Central America. He also said there must be the position of superior and inferior, and I am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. That was Lincoln. It goes on. I am not in favor of Negro citizenship. That was Lincoln.
You just blew my mind.
Pardon?
You just blew my mind, like, that he's,
And he was a politician. He was trying to win votes. This is what he had to say. In order to win votes in Illinois, that was to begin with a very racist state. Well, they presented him with a Declaration of Independence. And he said, well, the Declaration of Independence was intended to include all men, but did not mean to declare all men equal in all respects. Primitive word salad, going back and forth and trying to make himself comfortable in the fence. Talking about the slaves, he said, free them and make them politically and socially our equals. No way. My own feeling will not admit of this, and if mine would, we well know that those of the great mass of white people will not. We cannot make them equal. Oh, it goes on and on and on. After he became president, Frederick Douglass, the man in the statue up front by the courthouse, came to visit and asked for consideration for emancipation and whatnot. And Lincoln said, look, Fred, even when you cease to be slaves, you are yet far removed from being placed on an equality with the white race. On this broad continent, not a single man of your race is made the equal of a single man of ours. That was Lincoln. So, going back to the debates, of course he lost. The Republicans had 35 men in the Illinois House and 40 Democrats. The Republicans 11 seats in the Senate and 14 Democrats. So Douglas was elected. Lincoln's national profile was really enhanced. People took notice. So the debates that Douglas wanted to use to enhance his visibility worked in favor of Lincoln in the North, certainly not in the South. People in the South confirmed him as a black Republican. And for the Southern people, a Republican was a black Republican. Totally unacceptable. That's what happened with the Lincoln-Douglas debates. I may need to point out one thing here about Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas is considered like the bad guy in the debates. He's considered like the nemesis of Lincoln. Because the culture in general considers Lincoln a martyr, as he gave up his life, and the ultimate in preserving the Union, big monument, downtown Washington, many schools, $5 bill. So therefore, since for something good there has to be something bad, Lincoln embodies the good in this situation, and Douglas embodies the bad, or is considered as representing the opposite. Not so. Douglas was really an honest American. He was a politician. He was ambitious. He wanted to be president. He enjoyed the notoriety about being in Congress and being a respected and acknowledged senator. He was always a unionist. He said once that I don't care whether slavery is voted up or down, because he was committed to popular sovereignty. He was really committed to democracy. And if the people decided to go one way, that was the choice of the people. If the people decided to go the other way, that was the choice of the people. Am I getting through with this? So Douglas would have been an excellent executive. He died shortly afterwards, after the election. In October of 1860, it became clear that Lincoln was going to win the election. And Douglas was campaigning all over the Midwest and the Northeast. What does the guy do when he realizes that he's going to lose and Lincoln is going to win? He changes his program 100%. He changes his schedule completely. He goes into the lion's den. He goes to the South. He gives speech after speech after speech, telling the people Lincoln is not as bad as you think he is. Do not secede. Do not break up the Union. Support Lincoln. Wait, wait, wait. That's what he did.
I didn't.
That was he did. He supported, once he saw Lincoln winning, he supported Lincoln, went to the South, told the people there, don't secede. Don't act prematurely. Wait, wait, wait. You don't want to go there. This is going to end up poorly for all of us. So that's how Stephen Douglas, showed his real mettle. time called for it, he went through. Nobody thought bad things were bad in the 1850s. Well, things got worse. And one of the things that happened was the raid on Harper's Ferry by this gentleman, John Brown. You know, there's a road in the next county up north called John Brown Road. Probably St. John Brown. John Brown was a radical abolitionist. He wanted abolition, free the slaves, now completely, don't pay anybody, just free them by executive order. Whatever it takes, just free them. He had been in bloody Kansas, and he had chopped to pieces 5 men in Kansas who may have been slave catchers. Maybe they were slave catchers. But still, catching a slave should not be cause for having, for being chopped up in pieces. He believed that he was God's instrument in freeing the slaves. He had this messianic belief that he was about to do something. And he had massacred the 5 men at Potawatomi Creek in Kansas. He was never apprehended, even though he had been identified. They knew that he had done it. And they were on the search for him, but they were never able to pin him down. What he did with help from organizations in New England, particularly Massachusetts, was he brought a group of some of his children and other fanatics into Harper's Ferry, that at that time was Virginia, now it's West Virginia, and seized the arsenal there. The idea was to initiate a revolt of the slaves, arm them, tear down through Virginia into the Carolinas, and end up somewhere in Georgia. And that would give the abolition movement a lot of energy. Well, nobody told the slaves. Communications were very, very poor at that time. Or, there were no cell phones, there was no internet, there was no texting. Things would have been maybe different nowadays, but at that time there were not. And those who found out, the slaves, were just not interested, because they knew that they had more to lose in a revolt than to win. Therefore, the revolt came to nothing. About 7 men were killed, 10 injured, and things were bad. John Brown was eventually tried in the state of Virginia under state law, not federal law, state law, for treason against the state, not treason against the federal government. Apparently there was no law at that time defining treason against the federal government. So he was charged with treason against the state of Virginia, and that's why how he was executed. Well, the trial was covered by the national press. By then, the telegraph went everywhere. And the details of the trial, the details of the execution could travel very, very fast. The abolitionists believed that he was a hero, an icon, a martyr. On the other hand, the Southerners thought that he was a zealot, a fanatic, a madman, a terrorist. The Southerners blamed the black Republicans, which had nothing to do with this crazy man. But the thing was that the conflict became personal. It touched people in their homes. Any slave could break into the master's house and murder or slaughter everybody. They knew where the knives were. They knew where the axes were. So there was the question of fear that was developed and inculcated into the public after John Brown at Harper's Ferry. He was apparently a very, very charismatic individual. Yes, please.
Just one comment. You said treason wasn't federal law. Actually, treason is the only crime that's actually defined in the Constitution.
Yeah.
So yeah, they could have tried him under the Constitution, but that is the only crime that defined in the Constitution.
Yes,
And they defined it so you couldn't have your political opponent arrested for saying it.
yes, you are correct. Absolutely correct. Treason is the only crime defined in the Constitution. But apparently, there was no federal law at that time to try him and achieve what they wanted, which was the death sentence. And that's why they tried him in state court. A similar event occurred when John Kennedy was assassinated. There was no federal law for assassination of the president or the vice president. So if Lee Harvey Oswald or whoever was going to be tried, he would have to be tried in the state of Texas, where it happened. Then federal law was changed or improved or rewritten.
I think treason can only be used when you're at war, isn't that correct? Insurrection when it's not war.
Yes, that's accurate. That's accurate, thank you. The point that I was trying to make was that they had to try him in state court in order to achieve what they wanted, which was the death sentence. This is something that John Brown wrote himself. The crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. You should have known he had already murderized 5 people in Kansas. Well, 7 more, that's a lot. Without any bloodshed, it will not be done. So the element of fear came into play following the John Brown invasion and takeover of the armory at Harper's Ferry. In the winter of 1860, Lincoln was invited by a church in Brooklyn to come give a speech. And he was paid $300 for that. That was a lot of money then. But he had to take a train from Springfield, Illinois, all the way up to New York and then cross the river. There was no Brooklyn Bridge or subway at that time. In any event, he gets there and they say, no, we changed the venue. It's up at Cooper Union, which is in the Upper West Side. That morning, before he gave this speech, Lincoln got all dressed up and went to Matthew Grady's studio and got his picture taken. This is the picture how Lincoln looked when he gave the speech at the Cooper Union. You can see that his shirt cuffs stick out a little bit more, not there. These were brand new clothes. Whether they were mail order or not, we don't know. But certainly not perfect. So the speech at Cooper Union is lengthy, 7,000 words. The audience was big too, 1,500 people, and each of them paid, I think, 50 cents to get in. So Cooper Union made a nice profit even after they paid Mr. Lincoln. The speech is very entertaining and easy to read. It's divided into 3 parts. The first part is an argument that Lincoln makes that the men who wrote the Constitution initially did not intend for slavery to move into the territories. And his research was very, very, very thorough and quite convincing. This is quite good. So he supports with his argument the idea that originally the men who framed the Constitution did not intend for slavery to move into the future territories. The second part is like a mock debate with an imaginary person in the South, in which he argues one side and then the other, and back and forth they go. It's masterful spin. Talk about Lincoln spinning the issues, masterful. In today's day and age, we could say, well, it's the arguments are good, but they are not perfect. Then the third part is a call to the Republicans. Of course, he was speaking to 1,500 Republican young men at that time. He says, look, guys, we've come this far. Let's not give in or give up. Let's hold on to what we have achieved. And the main thing is to not let slavery go into the territories. Keep slavery out of the territories. Wherever slavery is present, let it be. They need it to maintain their economy and their way of life. But do not let slavery move into the territories. That made Lincoln a real candidate. That really made Lincoln popular enough and acknowledged in Republican circles that he became a credible candidate for president. Now, I'm going to ask you to wake up for a second and note that this address at Cooper Union was on February 27th. All right? Just keep that in the back of your mind or write it on the corner of a piece of paper. February 27th. Because we're going to come back and compare that date to something else that happened at that time. Following congressional elections every other year, and this was explained last week, I believe, the new Congress would not meet until 13 months hence, until not the following December, a year after. So the 36th Congress was elected in 1858 and had its first session, the long session, from December 1859 into 1860. In the Senate, there were mostly Democrats, In the House, they were mostly Republicans. The first thing the House has to do was elect a speaker. Well, guess what? They could not elect a speaker. They could not agree on anybody for speakership. They voted 44 times, 2 months, voting over and over and over and over, trying to elect the speaker. For the current Congress, how many weeks did we go without a speaker? 2 weeks? And there was a big scandal in the press, or in the press. Here at that time, they went for 8 weeks, 2 months, because they could not agree on something as a Speaker of the House. The House was totally deadlocked. Originally, John Sherman was the best candidate, and the House split North and South, Republican and Democrat. They carried revolvers in the House of Representatives. There was talk of secession, open talk of secession. And it was promised if a Republican was elected, any Republican. Finally, they elected William Pennington, who was a freshman congressman. This was his very first time in Congress. They ran out of candidates, so finally they had to turn to him. So let's not be surprised when our politics are so bizarre at times. All these things have happened before and much worse. Could we go on to the next step, please?
Yeah.
Good, thank you. We can get into the election of 1860. That was really momentous because that was what precipitated the final secession. There were all these parties available. The Democratic Party had split into the North and the South. The South were the Never Douglas. Just like we have the Never Trumps now. Yeah, the South was a Never Douglas. Stephen Douglas was not accepted in the South. The Whigs were dying off. The Know Nothings were in decline, even though they were, they held the Maryland House and Senate and the governorship at that time. There was the Constitutional Union Party that was formed by Whigs and Democrats that were unhappy with their party. And then finally, the Republican Party that was against slavery expansion, for free Kansas, land grants, internal improvements, and so forth. This is a cartoon from the time. Over here is Lincoln, Douglas, Breckinridge, and John, what was his name? John, will come to me in a second.
Quincy Adams.
All right, now things get interesting. The Democrats had their convention in Charleston, South Carolina, in April of 1860. To begin with, Charleston was too small for that kind of activity. There were not enough hotels. There were not enough restaurants. There were not enough bars. Not only that, to get to Charleston, you had to go by train, unless you wanted to go in a horse or in a buggy or something like that. And to get to Charleston, the train had to go to Columbia, upstate in South Carolina, and then come down. Trains were not air conditioned. They have to open up the windows to let in all the smoke and all the soot and all the garbage that the locomotives produce. And people would get to Charleston being tired, thirsty, angry, uncomfortable, yucky. It's like coming home after a horse show. Where you're just so miserable, sticky and whatnot. Totally uncomfortable. People were renting out their basements, putting cots in their basements to house the delegates in Charleston. On top of everything else, it was hot and humid. Just to add more punishment to the misery of the delegates. All right, so the convention finally gets underway, and remember Mr. Yancey? He was the one that had attended the convention in Baltimore in 1848 and had walked out, had thrown a hissy fit, and had walked out with one other candidate. Well, that was a dress rehearsal. He had it all planned out all over again. He proposed the Alabama platform that demanded federal guarantee of slavery in the territories, which he knew he was never going to get, and a federal slave code, which he knew he was never going to get either. So what does he do? He throws another hissy fit and walks out, but this time he walks out with 50-some delegates. So Mr. Yancey, that was a great speaker. He really had the gift of oratory. He storms out in protest, takes out the delegates from Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas. And what he does is he deprives everybody else from getting elected. Fine, if I cannot have it my way, you will not have it your way either. Now, some history books believe that Yancey did this on purpose, that he knew exactly what he was doing, that his idea was to split the Democratic Party, allow the Republicans to win the election, and then have a really good reason why the southern states should secede. That's attractive. That's an idea, that's a possibility. I'm not saying that that's what happened, but some history books work that idea, that Yancey split the Democratic Party in order to let the Republicans win. Once the Republicans win, then the southern states could split from the Union. So Stephen Douglas, who somehow had made it all the way to Charleston, had a majority of delegates, but he could not get the 2/3 votes necessary to become the nominee. The convention voted 57 times and could not get a nominee. Why? Because they were all outside the Congress. They had all left. Therefore, after several weeks, they said, look, this is enough. I'm history. I'm getting out of here. I'm going back home. Let's meet somewhere else in a few weeks, somewhere where there are better hotel rooms, there is better food, et cetera, et cetera. So they decided to move to Richmond. And in Richmond, they met once again, and sure enough, they got into a conflict, and they decided not to proceed. Instead, they got on the railroad and went to Baltimore. This is all the Democrats. Went to Baltimore and had their third convention. The only people that stayed in Richmond were the delegates from South Carolina and Florida. The state could not stand going up north anymore. Not going there anymore. We're staying right where we are. Probably they had their slaves with them, and they did not want to risk going into the District of Columbia or elsewhere with their slaves. So the Democrats reconvened at the Front Street Theater. There were replacement delegates that had been recruited. Many delegates who had walked out in Charleston were not seated in Baltimore, and they all boycotted the convention again. So that was the third walkout. They also left the convention. That's how split they were. Now, we're used to the coronation convention that we saw on television a few weeks ago. These conventions were fought fiercely all the way from day one to the end. Finally, the convention nominated Douglas and Herschel Johnson, accepted popular sovereignty and federal protection of slavery. The other group of Democrats went elsewhere to another theater in Baltimore, the Institute Hall, and nominated John C. Breckinridge for president of Joseph Lane. John C. Breckinridge was vice president with Buchanan. He was the up-and-coming young man of the Republican Party. Some people have likened him to what eventually John Kennedy would be. A tall, handsome, very intelligent, very articulate man with a big future. But the Civil War and Secession cut that. After all this conventioning, the delegates went back to Richmond. They made peace with the delegates from Florida and South Carolina and told them, look, we were in Baltimore. Baltimore was not that great, but we got things done. So let's all get together now and go on from there. The end result was the Democratic Party had two tickets. Each had its own platform. They were split over Lecompton, split over the Freeport Doctrine, split over popular sovereignty, split over the Alabama platform, and a federal slave code. How could they achieve anything? They were split over everything that mattered. Things got worse. Some of the folks that were unhappy with all the parties formed a fourth party, the Constitutional Union Party. It had been formed before, but this time they gave it shape. It was organized by John Crittenden of Kentucky, and their platform was the Union as it is, the Constitution as it is. No specifics, just that. John Bell was the fourth candidate for president. The Republicans, on the other hand, went to Chicago for a really fantastic convention. They met at this place called the Wigwam. The Wigwam was made strictly of lumber, no masonry, and was built for this purpose in particular. The candidates were William Seward, who had been governor of New York, Salmon Chase, Edward Bates, and Lincoln. Lincoln was still in Illinois, and the strategy was for the supporters of Lincoln to go to the supporters of the other candidates and say, look, you're going to support Mr. Seward. If Mr. Seward does not make it, will you support Lincoln? Well, yeah, okay. You support Mr. Chase, good. If Mr. Chase doesn't make it, will you support Lincoln? All right, we'll do that. And that's how they formed a coalition. And Lincoln was selected on the third ballot. The platform was straightforward, but there was no mention of polygamy, the Fugitive Slave Act, personal liberty laws, or Dred Scott decision. Anything that was very controversial, they left out. Now, controversial and unconventional were the methods of the wigwam. The people that supported Lincoln printed extra admission passes. So they loaded the galleries with supporters of Lincoln before anybody else was let in. The legend has it that there was a lot of refreshments being passed around. And that, in other words, there were a lot of plants also in the galleries trying to create furor or enthusiasm for Lincoln. Every time his name was brought up, a big demonstration occurred. In the first ballot, Seward had 173.5 votes, Lincoln 102. In the second one, 184 versus 181. And the third ballot, Lincoln wins when Ohio switched 4 votes. This is what happened then in the election of 1860. There is Douglas and Lincoln in the north, Breckinridge and Bell in the south. There were forces against Lincoln that tried to present a fusion ballot. That is, the 3 other candidates got together and said, can we come up with a single candidate? And Douglas said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go at it on my own. Good old Millard Fillmore, that really does not get a lot of credit in American history. He said, look, guys, you elect Lincoln, there's going to be secession, there's going to be trouble. I can see that, you can be sure of this. He predicted that very, very accurately. Jefferson Davis also predicted secession. Lincoln was warned, yet he thought that the arguments were pure rhetoric. It's just wind. The Democrats were discredited by a lot of scandals that we'll touch on later on. This is the results of the election. Lincoln carried less than 40% of the vote. So 60% of the vote was not for Lincoln. Breckinridge had 18%, Bell 12%, Stephen Douglas 29%. On the other hand, Lincoln won. He needed 150 electoral votes and he got 180. So that was fair, no question. A minority or a plurality in the popular vote, but certainly won the electoral vote. And Stephen Douglas, that pulled almost 1.5 million votes, won one state, and one state only, Missouri. The strategy had worked. Lincoln won the New England states, the western states, on all the Great Lake states. That's exactly what they had planned to do. Hang on to the states that they had won in 1856, flip Pennsylvania, flip Indiana or Illinois, and that will give the Republicans the presidency. And that's what happened.
Randy,
Yes.
can I add something a little bit? My research. So I saw this last class. Illinois was integral. You get Illinois to the whole thing, and Illinois had a huge immigrant population of Germans. And we found out later that Lincoln actually purchased a German newspaper and wrote a contract with them that they won't say only good stuff about him and the Republican Party and negative stuff about the opposite side. And if he says anything wrong, he's going to confiscate the presses and shut them down. Because he realized that German vote was so important for Illinois. So very contingent information behind the scenes.
It was very irregular. These elections were very, very irregular. And that has been the history of elections in the United States forever and ever. So let's not be surprised whenever irregularities are identified. There have always been irregularities. Thank you. So Breckinridge won the southern states. Bell took Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, and Douglas only Missouri. Definitely a section election. One section that had all the population or had a majority of the population was carried solidly by one candidate and won the presidency that way. What to do, what to do, what to do. The southern states feared that the Republicans would appoint judges, attorneys, marshals, postmasters, and others that would make slavery collapse. There was a fear. The abolitionists would encourage slave insurrections. They had just lived through John Brown. They were certainly afraid that the abolitionists would come up with more. The northern states would eventually become so numerous that they would outlaw slavery by constitutional amendment. Southerners were continuously discredited and humiliated. There were some people that were conditional unionists that said, look, yeah, you criticize slavery, you criticize our way of life that depends on slavery for its success, but we can take it. Let's just stifle the rhetoric. Let's just accept some compromise and keep on going. The other questions that the southern states had to deal with were several. Could the southern states defend themselves better inside the Union or outside the Union? Was it the right time to withdraw from the Union? How could the southern states withdraw from the Union and maintain their unity, since they would withdraw one by one? Secession was not easy. There were really a lot of problems to consider, and they had time to consider all of this. Many of these questions were really never answered. And this is in fact why life in the Confederacy was at times so chaotic. If the southern states acted separately, that is one at a time, at a time, at a time, would they become isolated and impotent? During the 1930s crisis, the tariff of abominations, South Carolina was the only one who decided to nullify the tariff. South Carolina went at it alone. And of course it failed. They had learned that. They knew they could not do it alone. Finally, if they waited too long, people lose interest in things. People forget things. People get busy with their everyday lives. So the passions fizzle and they lose momentum. Let's take a moment here to review what was the status of slavery in mid-century. We have already discussed how slavery produced the means by which the Southern way of life could be supported. It could have been oil, it could have been gold, it could have been diamonds, it could have been cattle. In that situation, it was slavery and cotton. In 1860, there were over 8 million white citizens in 15 slave states. And of these, only 4% were slave owners. Most people in the slave states were not slave owners. Actually, the vast majority were not. 69% or 69,000 owned one slave, and only 12% owned more than 20 slaves. It took about 15 slaves in order not to have to work himself. So the owner of a farm or plantation that had, say, 8 slaves had to go out in the field every day and work with them. This idea of all the whole South being like Tara or like 12 Oaks, it does not apply. That's only in the movies. Slave ownership was also a badge of position, necessary to fit into the social structure. We've all lived in places that had badge of positions. In some neighborhoods, it was, may still be, driving a Cadillac. In some neighborhoods, it may be having a swimming pool. In some neighborhoods, in some communities, it may be belonging to a country club. So in the southern states, owning slaves was a badge of position. If you aspired to be anything, to be recognized by society, you had to have slaves.
Now, Raymond, before you leave that last PowerPoint, I've always been puzzled to the second point in how the Confederacy could have raised such a large army when only 4% of the people were slaves. It just always puzzled me. And people have explained how that could be, and I never quite agreed.
Well, you can say, you can look at it this way. Slavery by itself was limited as far as the Southern society or all the problems they had. Slavery was a tool that supported their economy, supported their society. It could have been cattle, it could have been gold, it could have been oil, it could have been a number of things. But it was not just slavery. Slavery was just the delivery vessel.
If I can add to that, studies of diaries of the people of the South believe they were fighting for their independence.
States
Very much like the colonies fought for Britain. And that's what they're feeling, particularly when they started when Lincoln's going to send troops into the South. That's what they believed. And once you start sending troops in, then you defend your homeland and your independence, and more so what happened in slavery. And initially in the war, I'm sure we're going to get to, Lincoln wasn't trying to abolish slavery initially, at least until maybe that Emancipation Proclamation.
Independence and power.
I guess the only thing I could conclude, it was an issue, too, of states' rights. You've got so many of these people who who had no vested interest in slavery to put on a uniform, fight and die for the Confederacy. I mean,
And that's correct. After Mr. Lincoln said he's going to send 75,000 troops to enter the South, force the seven southern states return. 4 additional states seceded, mainly for that reason: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, I believe. And that was a states' rights issue, that you can't send troops in to conquer us. So it kind of flared up in that. And I don't mean taking thunder there. So.
Thank you very much. All right. Do you know that there were black slave owners? There were apparently about almost 4,000 in 1830, mostly in Louisiana, South Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. They owned, out of 2 million slaves in these states, about 12,000 slaves. This gentleman here, the photograph, rather elegant man, was Antoine Dubuclet. He owned more than 100 slaves. It was from in New Orleans. And what did he do with 100 slaves? He leased them out to work. It was like having a fleet of vans or a fleet of trucks. He leased them out. Some of these gentlemen also had white indentured servants. In other words, they had white folks that had been indentured to them, and they were basic functionally slaves for a period of time. So 400,000 people held 4 million slaves. Those that had 200 or more slaves were less than 1% of the population. And the record belongs to Joshua John Ward, that held 1,092 slaves. What do you do with 1,000 people that depend on you for work, for shelter, for food, for housing, for care, for everything? That must have been some business that he had to support.
let's hope it's one of ours.
Comes it goes. In South Carolina, as you remember from the second session, was the one that had stood up to the federal government on the issue of the tariff. Those were the ones that, South Carolina was the one who said, you can't do that. We are voiding that law. They had not received any support from any other states. So they tried hard to maintain their support from others or gather support from other states. In 1859, we're talking almost 2 years before the secession winter, South Carolina approached other states but found little enthusiasm. Let's wait until the election. Let's see what happens. Maybe the Republicans won't win. In the fall of 1860, the governor got in touch with other governors regarding joint action. And the others said, yeah, well, maybe, perhaps, I don't know. Let's see, wait and see. The 2 senators were James Chestnut, that was silent on secession. These were senators from South Carolina. And James Hammond, he was skeptical. He was like Douglas. He said, look, let's not do secession. It's not going to work out well for anybody. In November, this was after the election, the South Carolina legislature called for a state convention to be elected in January and would meet afterwards. Why did they wait that long? A couple of months between the election and the state convention to see if anybody else came up with the same idea, to make sure that they were not alone. So on November 8th, and this is how history develops, it was rumored that Robert Toombs, who was Georgia senator, had resigned from the Senate. He hadn't. This had not happened. It was only a rumor. But you know how strong rumors can travel, how fast can they travel, and how much they can influence opinions and decisions. Then it was announced that the governor of Georgia had urged his legislature to call a state convention. What did this mean? This is a critical point. That Georgia called a convention. South Carolina was not alone anymore. Georgia moved. Others would move. The first one was South Carolina. The second one was Georgia. Then James Chestnut announced his support of secession. And the last thing was a coincidence. They opened a railroad line from Savannah to Charleston. And of course, they had a party for the train to arrive, but the party turned out to be a secession party. They were celebrating the arrival of the railroad. But they didn't care very much about the railroad. They took the occasion for celebrate secession. Now that Georgia was ready to move, South Carolina moved faster. The legislature authorized an election on December 6th. The convention met on December 17th. And on December 20th, the South Carolina State Convention adopted the Ordinance of Secession. The Union was dissolved. December 20th, 1860. That's how it happened. South Carolina moved first, very hesitantly. Then Georgia moved. South Carolina just plunged straight ahead with renewed forces. December 20th, 1860. A few minutes ago, I asked you to write down the date of the address at Cooper Union. That was February 27th, 1860. On February 24th, 1860, 3 days before, the governor of Alabama had been authorized to call an election for a state convention. If a Republican was elected president, any Republican, Alabama moved before Lincoln became a national candidate. Before Lincoln had delivered the address at Cooper Union, Alabama, a year before, had already decided that it was going to move ahead. So all this secession, even though it was very challenging, was more or less planned. It was grossly planned. The election was called for on December 6th. The convention met. That was Alabama. Mississippi had an extraordinary session in November. Louisiana summoned the legislature. Florida approved the state convention. And in Texas, Sam Houston, who was governor, was overridden by the public. Sam Houston was against secession, but the people overrode his objections. December. That was the winter of their discontent. All these states then seceded. Within 23 days of Lincoln's election, 5 states had called state conventions. 1 had summoned the legislature. South Carolina had seceded. That was all within 3 weeks. Within 3 weeks of Lincoln's election, all those things had happened. They had had time to plan because they had seen what had happened in 1856. They knew how the Republicans were going to win the election, and they were prepared. I think this is the last slide in this section. Good.
Good time.
We are right on time.
You're a marvel.
This is all stuff you all know.
No.
Oh, yes, you do. They taught this at high school.